Hey CW Bio, Mr. Kennedy here. These are your cell energy notes that go along with our photosynthesis and cellular respiration chapters and our unit on life in a jar and energy transformations. The goal of these notes is really just to help you understand how cells use bonds to store and release energy and to kind of introduce you to the concept of photosynthesis, which we'll explore in more depth in a later video. So let's dive in. You might remember from a past lecture that Mr. Kennedy talked a lot about atoms and molecules, why atoms interact with other atoms, and how atoms interact with other atoms. At the end of the day, I don't want to go back through that entire lesson, but what I will remind you of is that atoms will interact with other atoms if an atom is unhappy. How do we determine whether an atom is happy? Well, we look at the octet rule. Does it have all the electrons it needs in its outer shell? Is it electrically neutral? Are all of the electrons paired up? If that's all true, then the atom is stable or happy. If any one of those things is not true, then the atom will be unstable or unhappy. When atoms make or break bonds, first of all, they're trying to reach stability or happiness, as I put it before, with the octet rule. The second thing that you have to remember is that anytime bonds are made or broken, there's an energy quotient that we have to deal with. Nothing in this world can happen for free. There's always going to be energy involved. If we take a stable, low energy molecule like what you can see here on this slide, like water, and we add energy to it, we can destabilize it and break the bonds that are holding it together. If we take energy out, we can return it to its stable form and make bonds between oxygen and hydrogen again. So down there at the bottom, breaking bonds will absorb energy because we're going to go from stable to unstable, and making bonds is going to release energy because you're going from unstable to stable. So what's all this have to do with, what's going on in a cell? Well, there's all kinds of reactions that occur in a cell. Some of them are spontaneous. We learned about those back in a past video where we were learning about enzymes. And others are not spontaneous, and, well, for lack of a better way to put it, they need an enzyme or some sort of catalyst to make them go. This graph is meant to remind you of that very idea. As we go from reactants to products in a chemical reaction, that little mountain that you see here in the middle is a representation of what we called back in our enzyme video activation energy, or the energy of activation. So that energy has to be dealt with, supplied, in order for the reactants to become products. If we let this reaction go without using a catalyst, you can see that that peak is higher than it would be if we used a catalyst. So catalysts reduce the amount of energy that is needed to make or break bonds. They make reactions go faster or maybe more efficiently, depending on how you want to look at it. Okay? Here's another way to look at it. All right? So same basic graph. We're going from reactants to products, right? And the reactants are stable. The products are stable. In the middle, we've got some instability, right? So we have to add energy to our stable molecules to make them unstable and force them to react, right? That's the whole idea of what a catalyst is doing for us. And I tried to include some illustrations for you down here with these blocks. So we've got a block sitting upright that's stable, and then over here it's laying on its side after the reaction has occurred, which is also stable. And in the middle we've got it tipping on its edge, which shows its instability. Okay? This very simplistic graph and drawing is a visual representation of what's going on in cellular respiration and photosynthesis, which is what you see down here at the bottom. In cellular respiration, we'd basically be going from stable reactants to stable products, and in the middle, we'd be giving off the energy that we need for life. Remember, right, when you form bonds between atoms to make other molecules than what you started with, energy can be released from that. And that's the energy that we use for life. Photosynthesis goes the exact opposite direction. Okay, so instead of releasing energy for life, it's taking solar energy and storing it for us. Here's another example using, the water bottle flip that you guys like doing when we're face to face in class, and can sometimes be rather, annoying to listen to. But it works like this, okay? In terms of a water bottle flip as a chemical reaction, basically what you're going to do is you take the water bottle, right, and you flip it in the air, okay? So I want you to make this diagram that shows a chemical reaction with an enzyme and without an enzyme, and use the water bottle flip as an analogy. I want you to include the bonds breaking and making. I want you to include the activation energy, the bond energy, and the enzyme, which is your hand grabbing it. Okay? The big question is the reaction storing up energy in the chemical bonds, like photosynthesis, or is it releasing energy, like in cellular respiration? Okay? So just to kind of remind you, again, of what's happening, right? If we think about our bottle flip, if we start off with the bottle upright, okay, it's stable, right? Then I have to grab it or push it or flip it in the air. That involves me adding energy to it using my hand as an enzyme. And ideally, if I did my bottle flip correctly, it should land on its cap, right, and stand straight up, which would also mean that is once again stable. Okay? So in the process, we hear like a loud bang when it hits the table, the water inside moves, all that kind of stuff like that. That's energy being released through that reaction. Okay? So that's the idea of how energy is involved in making or breaking bonds and how this graph plays out. Ultimately, to survive, all organisms need to do chemical reactions all the time. We need them for growth, repair, we need it for maintenance, we need it to basically change our environments, and every chemical reaction requires some form of activation energy. Some have really, really high peaks of activation energy that have to be satisfied, others not so much. Now, if you're a plant, you can get that activation energy maybe supplied by sunlight, or you can use this really cool molecule called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And you might remember this from a previous lecture. ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is the energy currency for all cells. It's kind of like money. And there's this saying that says, well, money is what makes the world go round. Well, ATP is what makes like life go round, okay? ATP is made up of an adenosine base, a sugar called ribose, and then 3 phosphate groups. Now, the energy in ATP is actually held between those 3 phosphate groups. Phosphates are positively charged, so they don't want to be near each other, and it takes a lot of energy to like hold them together, okay? So that's where the energy is stored in an ATP molecule. When those bonds break, ATP can release a lot of energy because, again, it contains a bond that's easy to break, almost unstable, and has a lot of energy stored in it. As ATP is formed and broken, it will oscillate, as you can see from this picture in the bottom of the slide, between its regular form, ATP, and a, broken down form called ADP plus PI. ATP is adenosine triphosphate, has 3 phosphates. ADP is adenosine diphosphate, so there's only 2. The plus PI would be that 3rd phosphate that's been broken off. Okay? Now, where do we get the energy to make these bonds and hold the phosphate in place, and where does the energy go when a phosphate is broken off? Well, that's also in the picture. Energy from catabolism, that basically means when you break down your food, right? Digestion, cellular respiration, and even, proton gradients from photosynthesis, like that can supply the energy to make ATP. When that phosphate's broken off on the end, that's when the energy is made available to go do work other places. Maybe that means that a cell can divide. It uses the energy for that. Maybe that means that a cell can swim. It uses the energy for that. right? That's what it means to have energy available to do work. So here we are again with our graph, right? And remember, right, some reactions have really, really high amounts of activation energy that have to be supplied before the reaction can go, and others not so much. So here we have two reactions. Reaction 1 is ATP breaking to make ADP plus PI. So that you can see there's not a really, really big peak there or a large amount of activation energy that's required in order to make this reaction go, because the bonds between the phosphates that ATP is holding are, well, relatively unstable and easily broken. So that reaction is almost spontaneous. It'll just go. It'll just happen. And as it happens, energy is released. Now, if we flip the script and we want to go from ADP to ATP, well, that's reaction 2, and maybe that reaction takes a huge energy input from your food or from the sun or from a proton gradient or whatever. Or maybe it's just reaction 2 is some other reaction going on in the body and it needs energy to go. Well, that energy from ATP can be used to push that ball up over the mountain there of activation energy that needs to be met. Okay? Now, sources of ATP, right? Here's a list. If you're a plant, you can make your own food, right? And ultimately then your own ATP from cellular respiration. But you also need an energy source in order to do that. It could be an inorganic compound like hydrogen sulfide. That's what chemosynthesis is all about. Or sunlight, which is what photosynthesis is all about. Okay? In photosynthesis, we use the sun's energy to build a proton gradient. And at the end of the day, that proton gradient makes some ATP for us. We can even store extra ATP as sugars if we're a plant. Okay? Heterotrophs, well, it takes sugar or food basically to make ATP, so you got to eat. Once you break that sugar down through cellular respiration, that's where you're going to get the energy to make your ATP. And there are two types of like cellular respiration that we need to be familiar with, and there's another video on this later, so for now just take my word for it, planes fly, and there's two types. One type uses oxygen, it's called aerobic respiration, and the other type is no oxygen, anaerobic respiration. And that anaerobic respiration, well, for us, that's the one that gives us like sore muscles when we exercise for long periods of time. If you were a plant, that anaerobic respiration could maybe produce alcohol. Okay? You might remember this picture from a previous video that I gave you on photosynthesis, or maybe just use it as an introduction if you haven't seen that video yet. This is the equation for photosynthesis. So the last part of these notes is just going to focus on, hey, like this is photosynthesis as an overview and kind of how it works. And then, like, you know, if you want to watch that other video that goes in great depth, you can do that later. So the equation for photosynthesis is 6 carbon dioxides plus 6 waters yields glucose and 6 oxygens. Okay? So carbon dioxide and water are the reactants, glucose and oxygen are your products. Now in order to like make this reaction occur, there's kind of like 2 steps that we gotta visit in regards to photosynthesis. And that is the light-dependent reactions, also known as the light reactions, and the light-independent reactions, also known as the dark reactions or the Calvin cycle. And just to kind of sum up what's going on there, in the light reaction we capture light energy, we convert that light energy into an electron carrier called NADPH and ATP. Okay? And then in the light-independent reaction, or dark reaction, that's where we get the storage of chemical energy as a sugar. So here's a couple of slides just to kind of show you what these things look like and some of the parts that are involved in it. And again, you'll see this in a later lecture. Okay? So the first thing that we got to deal with is what light is used for photosynthesis. And that is our visible light, light that makes up Roy G. Biv, comes in 7 different wavelengths, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet, which you can see in this picture. Chlorophyll is the light absorbing pigment that actually traps this white light, does a great job capturing pretty much all colors of light except for green, which is reflected. And using the pictures over here on the left of this slide, you can kind of see where that happens. the light energy is captured in tiny little organelles inside of a plant cell called a chloroplast that has the pigment chlorophyll in it, right? And that chlorophyll is embedded in those tiny little green pancakes that you see in the bottom left-hand corner called thylakoids, right, in the thylakoid membrane. Moving on. So chlorophyll is found within the thylakoids of the chloroplast, as I just said. And just to kind of sum it up in words, without a lot of pictures just yet, chlorophyll traps the light energy in the electrons of its atoms and energizes them. So as chlorophyll becomes energized by light energy, those electrons are going to be passed to an electron transport chain. But at the same time the electrons are being passed to an electron transport chain, water is also going to be split inside of the chloroplast at the thylakoid membrane. The splitting of water is important because it replaces those lost electrons that chlorophyll kicked off to an electron transport chain. Okay? Energy from the electrons is going to be passed through this electron transport chain and ultimately used to make a proton gradient that later will give us some ATP and our NADPH. The end products of the light reaction include oxygen. Okay, that's pretty cool. We need that to breathe. And then the ATP and the NADPH that are going to power the dark reaction. Here's a diagram just to try to illustrate some of those points. And this is something that you're going to want to pay close attention to because you need to know this picture. You need to know what's going in and what's coming out. So what we've talked about so far is all the stuff that's going on over here on the left, or basically the light reactions. Okay? The other part of photosynthesis is the light independent reaction, or Calvin cycle, or dark reaction that occurs over here on the left. Okay? So the one thing that I want you to focus on right now is what's coming in and what's going out. So what's coming into the light reaction is light and water, right? And magic is happening here in the thylakoid membranes that we call the light dependent reactions, to be explored in more depth later. And coming out is oxygen as a waste product that we end up breathing, and then some ATP and some NADPH, which is energized, like, powerful molecules that go on to the Calvin cycle to drive it. So far so good? I hope so. All right, so moving on. This is just meant to kind of illustrate the connections between the light and the dark reactions using a little bit different diagram. So again, we've got our light reactions occurring here. Okay, we've got our intermediate molecules here and our dark reactions here. So just to sum it up, the light reactions are coming in, splitting water and causing this stuff, ATP and NADPH, to be made in the light reaction. So water and sunlight go into the light reaction and water is split, and what we get is we get oxygen as a waste product and we get our ATP, NADPH, right, that's going to go over here to the dark reaction. Eventually the dark reaction is going to make our glucose for us, but that's a different story for a different day. Okay, light independent reaction. So the ATP and the NADPH are going to be used to fix a gas, carbon dioxide, and make it into glucose. Now these are called the dark reactions or light independent reactions because basically they occur in the absence of light. Okay, it's not that they occur only at night, it's just that they don't need light in order for them to happen. Sometimes they're called the Calvin cycle because a guy by the name of Melvin Calvin is the one who discovered it. So let me just sum it up for you in words and then I'll show you a picture and you'll be all done. Yay! Okay, so we're going to get 3 carbon dioxides that are going to diffuse into the stroma of the chloroplast, and they're going to combine with 3 5-carbon sugars called RUBP, ribulose 1,5-biphosphate. Now this is a super unstable molecule, so as soon as that connection happens, boom, it breaks, right? It breaks into 3 carbon sugars, which, just take my word for it, they're 3 carbon sugars. You don't have to memorize the names of every single step in this process. After you have those 3 carbon sugars, ATP and NADPH from the light reaction is going to come in and push the Calvin cycle to the next set of reactions. And in that next series, one of those 3 carbon sugars is going to be set aside to become a 6 carbon glucose a little bit later. 2 cycles are needed to make a single glucose molecule, because as we rotate, right, again and again and again, you can see you're making 3 carbon sugars at a time, and glucose is a 6 carbon molecule. So do the math, right? That's why you have to have multiple rotations in order to pull this off. So in a picture sense, this is what the Calvin cycle looks like. All right. Remember what I said, you don't have to memorize like the names of every one of those molecules, but here we have our CO2 combining with our RUBP to make an unstable 6 carbon compound that splits into 2 3 carbon sugars. Here's our NADP and ATP that comes in and pushes us to the next step, where we have a molecule called phosphoglyceraldehyde, which is also a 3 carbon sugar, and you have 2 of those. This phosphoglyceraldehyde, one of them will go around to sustain this cycle, okay, and make more RUBP, and another one is going to be set aside to make a sugar. So this is just one visual representation. Here's another one that looks kind of like what's in your book. It's basically showing you the same thing. Okay, so RUBP, carbon dioxide, right? Unstable 6 carbon molecule is already split here because it's just showing the 3 carbon one. Here's our ATP from the light reaction, and our NADP from the light reaction, and our PGAL, or phosphoglyceraldehyde, which is produced here. Remember, one of them goes around to keep the RUBP going, and the other one comes off as set aside to make a sugar. Okay, so more to come on this later. This is just an introduction. All right, so in closing, gang, this is what photosynthesis looks like, and it's just a great example of how bonds are made and broken, and how energy, in this case energy from the sun, is required to make it all happen. All right, I'm Mr. Kennedy. These are your notes on cells and energy transformation. I hope this helps. I'll see you next time.